The moon has three resources valuable enough to reshape Earth's energy economy and space strategy, and no binding law to prevent two nuclear-armed rivals from competing for the exact same deposit. That single sentence describes the entire geopolitical situation in space right now. Not a future scenario, not a science fiction plot, a race that is already underway between two blocks that have already divided most of Earth between them, now extending that division to a body 384,000 kilometers away, with no court, no police force, and no agreement on what the rules are. Picture Shackleton Crater. It sits at the moon's south pole, permanently dark, 4 kilometers deep, cold enough to freeze gasoline and stay that way for 4 billion years. Scientists believe it holds water ice deposited by ancient comets, ice that has never been touched by sunlight since the early solar system. NASA has it on a landing site shortlist. China has it on a landing site shortlist. There is currently no agreement on what happens when both arrive. The only document that governs this is almost 60 years old, and it doesn't mention water ice, resource extraction, or what to do when two rival nations plant bases within a few kilometers of each other. This is not a science problem. It's a property law problem on a body that has no property law.
Here's the part that sounds like it should stop the conflict before it starts. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty, the agreement that has governed space for over 50 years, says no nation can claim the moon as territory. You'd think that settles it. Nobody owns the moon, nobody fights over it. The same logic that kept space peaceful during the Cold War applies now. Pause right now and think about this before reading further. The treaty says you cannot claim territory. It says nothing about what happens to resources you extract. If you land on the moon and scoop up water ice, does that water belong to you? The treaty is completely silent. And if your base needs to establish a reasonable operational safety zone around your equipment to protect your crew, how large is that zone? Who decides what's reasonable? The treaty doesn't say. There is no court. There is no enforcement mechanism. There is no penalty structure for violations. Zero. You've just found the loophole that two rival blocs are racing to exploit. The United States understood this gap, and in 2015 passed its own law explicitly allowing American companies to own whatever they extract from space. Luxembourg passed similar legislation. These aren't fringe interpretations, they're direct responses to the treaty's silence on extraction rights. China has not agreed this is legal. Russia called the US-led Artemis Accords, the framework trying to establish norms among cooperating nations, too US-centric and refused to sign. The result is two blocs heading for the same crater, operating under fundamentally incompatible legal assumptions with no shared court to resolve the disagreement. Now let's talk about what they're actually racing for, because the moon has resources, undersells it badly. The South Pole craters hold frozen water, not a novelty, a strategic weapon. Water on the moon can be split into hydrogen and oxygen, giving you rocket fuel and breathable air on a body where neither exists naturally. Control the South Pole water, and you control the refueling depot for every mission that goes beyond Earth orbit. Every Mars mission, every deep space operation, every cis-lunar economy runs through whoever holds that water. It's like an oil field in the middle of disputed international waters, except the oil can be converted into the only fuel that works in space, and the nearest alternative supplier is 384,000 kilometers away. NASA's geological mapping, updated in 2025, confirmed that the permanently shadowed craters hold significantly more water ice than earlier estimates suggested, enough to sustain a permanent base and produce rocket fuel for Mars missions. The economic value of that water isn't measured in the water itself, it's measured in everything that water makes possible. Potentially trillions of dollars of future space economy flow through a collection of black, frozen crater floors that no human being has physically visited. Then there's helium-3, a gas so rare on Earth that a single kilogram costs $20 million today, roughly the price of a large apartment building in a major city, for quantum computing applications alone. The moon has accumulated over 1 million tons of it from solar wind exposure over 4 billion years.
That's not a resource. That's an inheritance the size of a mountain range, sitting on a body with no ownership law, no police, and no court. Some regions of the lunar surface contain titanium at 10 times the concentration of equivalent Earth rocks, over 20% of some rock samples by weight. On Earth, titanium at those concentrations would be one of the most valuable mining sites on the planet. On the Moon, it sits next to the water ice and the helium-3 with the same legal status. Whoever gets there first gets to define what reasonable means. Here's where it stops being abstract. Here's where you need to decide something. You're an international space lawyer. Country A lands at Shackleton Crater first and declares a 50-kilometer safety buffer around their base, citing the need to protect their crew from accidental interference. Country B arrives 3 months later with their own base, 15 kilometers away. Country A says that violates their safety zone. Country B says the treaty only bans territorial claims, not operations within them. Neither country has signed the other's legal framework. Think about it for a moment. Who's right? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and that's precisely why conflict is likely. Legal scholars describe the Outer Space Treaty as written in broad language that effectively creates a first-mover advantage. The first entity to occupy any location gets unilateral power to define what reasonable operational zone means. And because there's no enforcement mechanism, that zone can be made as large as practical convenience demands. Both interpretations of the treaty are legally defensible. Neither country can be forced to comply. The case goes to no court because no court has jurisdiction. We've seen this playbook before. In 2013, China requested an unusually large managed area around its Antarctic research station, testing exactly this kind of first-mover zone expansion. The Antarctic Treaty Community refused. Since then, China has quietly complicated Antarctic treaty decision-making at every opportunity, learning the system from the inside. Watch what someone does in a small test case before the stakes are high. The Moon is where the stakes are highest. So what's the solution? Here's the part that should alarm you. There isn't one. Not yet. Not in time. The United Nations released draft principles for lunar activity in 2025. They deliberately mirror the Outer Space Treaty's vague language. The safety zone loophole remains unaddressed. The Artemis Accords try to establish shared norms, but China and Russia have built their own coalition of 13 nations around a competing framework, the International Lunar Research Station Program, making any US-led standard non-universal by definition. Not a single country has joined both. The world has split into two camps operating under two incompatible sets of rules, and both camps have the Moon's south poles circled on their mission maps. The closest historical model that actually worked is the Antarctic Treaty, but that took years of patient negotiation, required no commercial mining interest, and had no competitive resource race driving it. China is already straining that treaty, now, decades after it was signed. On the Moon, the resources are orders of magnitude more valuable. The race is compressed into years rather than decades, and the legal infrastructure is more primitive than anything that governed Antarctica. The realistic fix is a binding international lunar resource treaty, negotiated and ratified before the first territorial dispute, not drafted in response to a crisis that's already escalated. That's how maritime law got built. That's how deep-sea mining rights got established. The pattern is consistent. Technology arrives, resources become accessible, conflict pressure builds, legal frameworks scramble to catch up. Sometimes they catch up in time. Sometimes they don't. Here's the prediction that will define space law for the next century. It's 2031. Both the US Artemis base and China's Lunar South Pole base have established operations within 15 kilometers of each other. A Chinese rover enters the declared Artemis safety zone to access a water ice deposit. NASA tells them to withdraw. What happens next? Think through every available response. If China complies, they've acknowledged the US safety zone as legally binding, which sets a precedent their entire legal framework rejects. If China ignores the request, the US has to decide whether to do nothing, escalate to Earth diplomacy, or take some kind of action on the Moon itself. Every option available has bad consequences. Earth diplomacy between nuclear-armed rivals over a moon-based dispute is not a solved problem. Escalation in a place where both nations have bases, equipment, and potentially crew within line of sight of each other is not a scenario any treaty addresses. The realistic answer is that the first incident gets managed through back-channel diplomacy. Everyone backs off slightly, and both sides learn which pressure points work. Just like the South China Sea, just like Antarctica. Incrementally, the stronger presence expands its definition of reasonable. The weaker presence accepts it or escalates. Neither outcome resolves the underlying legal ambiguity. It just teaches both sides how far they can push. Here's the dark irony that closes all of it. The most strategically important real estate in the solar system, the resource that controls refueling for every human mission beyond Earth orbit, the thing worth potentially trillions, the asset that determines who dominates cislunar space for the next century, looks, in satellite photos, like a black smudge, a cold, dark patch at the bottom of a crater. No flags, no bases yet, just frozen water and 4 billion years of solar wind deposits sitting in permanent shadow, waiting for the first nation that plants something there and declares what reasonable means. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty will be tested by a dispute nobody has enforced it against, between two rival blocs that have already split the rest of the world between them over a black smudge that nobody has physically visited. Physics wrote the moon's geology. Humans will write the conflict. The treaty has a hole in it big enough to start a war over.